Welcome to Baby Theater in the Dark, where we tell spooky stories. The story we tell today is about the ghost of Gooberville. The ghost of Gooberville, well, I will tell you, he is an older ghost. He's been dead for many years. I would say somewhere between 89 to 103. And the dead bodies that he's gathered pile up by the fray. You see, he sleeps in graveyards, but he finds only the decayed bodies that arise from the ground in depths. He makes sure that their corpses are destroyed and placed upon his burial ground in his own casket, littered with thousands of corpses. Yes, he's had to dig a little deeper than most to bury these corpses, but none are the wiser as they're buried below his own body. One would think that this would be a difficult task, but he's no ordinary ghost. He uses the power of the wind to guide him and aid him in his task. The wind blows, and it's able to prevent any kind of attention to be drawn. Nobody likes a noisy graveyard with spooky wind during the night. Yes. The spookiness of the graveyard does indeed prevent people from coming there. But the true genius of its plan involves a pulley system that revolves around a small fan that generates electricity. He then uses this electricity to widen his body to make sure that he can accommodate their corpse. Once he digs the hole, that is really the last plan he has before he dumps the corpse in. It's a fairly interesting decision that he's made for himself. Now, one day, there was a onlooker. She was a bit of a goth, and she didn't mind the wind so much. So, as she was walking, she found all these contraptions, and in the contraptions, she saw the genius of it all. The sheer ingenuity, one would say. Well, once she found this, she started to pull out her crystals, and she peered into them and she said, if there's a spirit here that's taking his bodies, well, I'd like to meet that spirit, she says. And she uses the crystals. And I'll say that the ghost of Gooberville, well, he really couldn't resist. He popped open the crystal with a little ee and came out and said, hello. It is I, the ghost of Gooberville. The girl, she said, well, there's no such thing as Gooberville, ha ha ha. Silly girl. That was the one strike that he was looking for. And so, he grabbed her quickly, threw her over his shoulder, and quietly began to take her down to the corpses. And before she knew it, she was surrounded. And suddenly, the darkness. There was rustling. Much rustling in the dark. And she couldn't exactly tell what was going on. The ghost had taken her to her own private area in the cavernous depths. And one could say that she was made to feel like home since she was goth. And one might also say that she was clearly curious of what awaited her and what she might foretell the Gooberville. Well, she did dive in quite well, and she began to waltz around and quickly realized that she was chained to a wall, and the rinking chains shifted, and it seemed like all of the corpses in the room began to stare at her. Yet, she didn't see this. She could only feel their watching eyes upon her. Now, one might say that this girl, Cynthia, was in over her head. But what would be incorrect? You see, Cynthia planned this all along. She'd heard of Gooberville. She just wanted to see it for herself. The only claim to fame that Gooberville had was that of spirits and ghosts and myths. What better way to get to Gooberville than insult a Goobervillian? And in this case, possibly a Goobervillian. I digress. You see, what the ghosts of Gooberville had in mind for Cynthia was much more interesting than she had planned. As the lights came on, dreary flickering of lights, suddenly before her, a table, around her, corpses around the table. Upon the table, teapots. Dozens of teapots. One for each corpse. You see, the ghost of Gooberville, he gathered all these corpses, lost and aware. And I once said obliterated the corpses, and this is true. Yet how can obliterated corpse be sitting there smiling at her with teeth rotted as hell? Well, I'll tell you. The obliteration of the corpse is a metaphor, as they are greeted just as a normal, typical human is to be greeted. Yes, the ghost of Gooberville was actually the mayor of Gooberville, and he brought all of the Goobervillians into a tea party. They all had smiles upon their faces. They could maneuver their hands and drink tea, corroding their flesh. And there Cynthia was, astonished that all these corpses had mobility and and danced around almost near the room. Ah, you see, after all this, these weren't corpses after all. They were simply posthumous diaries. Yes, the curiosities. How they were alive? Well, that's for scientists to tell. The ghost of Gooberville. Well, he did well on them. And now Cynthia. Well, she was Goobervillian for life. And she would live her days out drinking tea and eating crumpets that the local bakery threw out into the dumpsters as plentiful as leaves on trees. Yes. And Cynthia would bring them now. They would have a human to take this risk instead of a rotting corpse drifting along town. Ah, yes. And that's where Cynthia had the rumors. As a matter of fact, that particular bakery had told her of Gooberville, and all corpses sat around drinking tea and eating crumpets. They were right.